Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's webinar. I'm Sarah Valdis, the Director of Environment, and thank you so much for taking the time to attend. We hope you will find it useful and assist you to be able to give your feedback on the draft study and provide you with an opportunity to ask questions. Initially, I just need to mention a few technical points for this evening. If you wish to see closed captions on speakers' words, please click the CC button on the bottom right of the screen and they should then appear after about 30 seconds or so. The system sometimes takes a little longer to get warmed up. If you have any technical issues, then they're usually solved by closing down the link and then rejoining. You're welcome to submit a question to be answered using the chat function, but also please leave your name and we will answer as many as we're able to later. The Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site is a key historic environment asset in Wiltshire of international significance, and the Council continues to progress ways to help protect the World Heritage Site and its landscape settings. The setting study is a key way of doing this, and we were working hard over the last few months to enable this document to be developed, gain support, and to take it through the various stages of approval, which will end with its adoption by the Council later this year. It's been particularly valuable to have worked with World Heritage Site partners during this period of development, but we're keen to get the views of the wider public, and having you on this call this evening is very valuable to us. We look forward to hearing your feedback in both this session and later in writing if you wish to contribute further. I'll now hand over to Andrew Croft from Chris Blandford Associates to take you through the presentation for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome everybody, and thank you for taking the time to be here this evening. So today, the purpose of the webinar is to introduce you to the SPD document and to help answer any questions that will then enable you to comment better. I'd just like to stress it's really important that if you have comments, you have contributions, that they are written and submitted to the formal channels, and that way they can be captured alongside all other respondees and be dealt with in a consistent manner as the SPD is brought forward for adoption. So in terms of today, I'm going to sort of take you through a short presentation, 15-20 minutes on the SPD, during which, if you have any questions as you go through, please type them in the chat and we'll pick them up at the end when we have a Q&A session and a bit of a discussion session at the end. As I just mentioned, there is a website for the formal consultation, the web link's there, and I'll have a section at the end of the presentation which talks in a little bit more detail about how to respond, the types of questions, and sets out other avenues. For instance, there's a face-to-face meeting coming up in June, and where you can get printed copies, etc. So we'll deal with all that at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So on the call today and available to ask questions later, there's a range of representatives from Wiltshire Council with Sarah, Lynn and Melanie. Then from the World Heritage Partnership, we have Claire and George. And then from CBA, we have myself and Adam as the consultants that have been supporting the development of the SPD. So moving on to the next. So without much delay, I'd like to talk you through the SPD. Move on to the next slide and set out what it's trying to achieve. So I'd like to talk through the process of its development, the time frame, how we've developed this, who we've worked with, so you can understand that general background. Set out what the SPD is seeking to achieve, and that's really clear, to understand its parameters. And then a talk about how the SPD sets out an approach to assessing change, because that's fundamental both in the context of international requirements, but also in terms of English planning policy and planning law. A brief discussion then about the geographical coverage of the SPD, how different types of development have different scales of coverage in the county. And then finally, a very brief look at some of the description of the setting presented in the SPD. After we've gone through the SPD, we'll then move on to consultation and questions. So next slide, please. So the SPD, a draft was completed last summer. That pulled together a period of time of research and analysis. We then met the partnership panel They provided detailed comments and feedback. The document was then updated, then came out to the World Heritage Steering Committee, more feedback and more updates. That finalised document was then prepared in early 25, and the Council reviewed the document and in March 2025 approved it for consultation following the recent elections. And that's what we're starting now. Consultation period starts, I believe it was last week, and runs to the middle of June. Next slide, please. So the SPD. A supplementary planning document is a document that is there to support a local plan and particular policies in the local plan. In that context, this SPD is designed to support the current local plan and the emerging local plan for Wiltshire. Its primary aim is to support the local plan in safeguarding the outstanding universal value of the World Heritage Site. It will do this by providing a robust and consistent approach to assessing impact, which can support decision making around developments within and around the World Heritage Site. There's also been a lot of change over the last 5-10 years, both nationally and internationally, in terms of guidance on setting, guidance on impact assessment. So 2017, we have the Historic England guidance on setting. In 2022, UNESCO, ICOMOS, IUCN published their guidance on heritage impact assessment for World Heritage Sites. As we're also aware, NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework, and National Planning Policy Guidance have been undergoing considerable change over the last decade or so. So this document is the time to bring all that together and set out a consistent approach for supporting decision making in relation to planning. Next, please. It's intended to be used by a wide variety of audiences. So primarily, it's there for developers, designers and their agents to use as a tool to guide and shape their development. It's also there for the decision makers, predominantly Wiltshire Council, but occasionally it may be another decision maker such as the Secretary of State, for them to use and ensure that developers and agents have brought forward schemes in a consistent manner and have sought to mitigate and remove any potential harm to the World Heritage Site. At a slightly different level, it's also there to support householders, predominantly within the World Heritage Site, but also close to the World Heritage Site, considering development and understanding whether their development will actually need a HIA or not. And then finally, we expect various consultees, statutory and non-statutory consultees, to be able to use the document to inform their responses to development proposals in the county. Okay, next, please. So central to this, and this is really important about the SPD, and I apologise for the screen, exceptionally difficult to read. It's a lot easier to read in the main document itself. There's a process of assessment. This process is modelled on the UNESCO guidance. So this staged approach, 8 stages, is modelled on the UNESCO guidance and also takes into account the requirements of national planning policy. So the first, and actually probably the most important step for the majority of people, is the screening. And the purpose of this is to say, does this development require HIA? And I'll talk through briefly on a following slide in a minute around the different types of development and how we can ascertain if they need to be screened. So the first step is screening. Not every development in Wiltshire will need to be screened. So it goes through that process, at the end of which, if it is agreed that it does require HIA, for a potential impact on setting or the physical remains of a site, then a scoping report is prepared. This could be quite an extensive document for a major development with lots of risks, or a very short, very concise document for a very small, low-risk development. Once that's in place, then they move through the more standard stages of preparing baseline, preparing assessments, landscape assessments, visual viewpoints, archaeological background, research, looking at the attributes of OUV, a solid baseline analysis drawn from the areas that are being focused on through the scoping report. With that in place, you undertake your impact assessment. Then, your really important stage 5, you go back to the development and say, well, look, we've undertaken an impact assessment. We've identified this risk, this issue, this particular concern. How can we amend this development? How can we introduce mitigation to address those issues? Then you prepare the full HIA following that, taking into account all those change. That is submitted to the planning authority or the decision maker in the case of Secretary of State. They then use that to inform their decision making, which could be rejection or could be acceptance of the development. And then finally, there's a final stage where there is some outcome reporting and potential follow-up, mainly done through conditions. So it's a very structured process that's designed to be proportionate to the scale of development and to the potential risk that a development poses. So if we just move on to the next slide. Now, the SPD itself applies to the whole of Wiltshire. Everywhere in Wiltshire falls within the bounds of the SPD, but not every development in Wiltshire needs to be assessed. So I'll show you on the next slide that different scales of development have different parameters for going into the screening process. However, when it comes to tall structures, with the re-emergence of potential onshore wind energy in England or major national significant infrastructure projects, the SPD does require that all such developments in Wiltshire are screened. Most will be screened out, but some may need to be screened in and undergo the full process. So if we move to the next slide, once again, another horribly overly detailed slide. It's set out far more clearly in the main document. So Wiltshire Council has a series of different development types that it uses for pre-application advice. So this SPD has adopted those and sets out parameters for screening. So take, for example, a medium scale residential or commercial development, 40, 50 houses, something like that. If that is within the World Heritage Site or within a kilometre of the World Heritage Site, it's going to need screening. If it lies close to any of the key astronomical alignments at Stonehenge or their backdrops, it's going to need screening. If it sits on any sensitive ridgelines or really elevated areas around the World Heritage Site, it's going to need screening. When you then compare that through sort of a large scale major development project, similar parameters, but within 5 kilometres of the World Heritage Site. And similarly, for when you're looking at waste and mineral developments, different scales of development will engender different levels of concern. Therefore, the boundaries for those become larger around the World Heritage Site. So this is really driven by the need for proportionality. There's going to be very few times that a very small development 5 kilometres away from the World Heritage Site poses any risk to its OUV and setting. However, if it's close to an astronomical alignment or on a key ridgeline, it may need to be looked at. So this is all around proportionality. And these two parts, this sort of setting out this geographic coverage for different types of development and setting out the assessment process with all the guidance, are probably the real core heart of this SPD and really will enable consistent decision making into the future. Next slide, please. But to do that decision making, you need an evidence base. Now, what the SPD does not do is describe the setting of every single major monument in the World Heritage Site and the whole of every single part of the World Heritage Site. Its primary purpose is to provide an overview of the setting of each part of the World Heritage Site separately and of some of the monuments within them. And then for an applicant and a developer to come forward and undertake an assessment that draws on that material, but expands and builds on it through more detailed research, more detailed analysis. So very much the description of setting in the SPD is the starting point of a journey. It may be largely sufficient for a smaller development, but particularly for larger developments, more complex developments, or those in more sensitive areas, far more research and analysis and assessment will be required. Now, what's being presented in the SPD? It's a very structured, thematic description. It draws heavily on approaches sort of advocated by the Historic England guidance from 2017, looking at a range of different factors. Critically, because this is a World Heritage Site, everything has to relate back to the attributes, the elements of outstanding universal value as defined in the World Heritage Site Management Plan, which are then based on the statement of outstanding universal value adopted by UNESCO. So there's a clear connection here between what's described and assessed in this document and how UNESCO has inscribed this site. So it's a starting point. It's not the all and the be all. More complex developments will require far more work. Next slide, please. So in that, under those themes, the themes used are essentially the same for the Avebury part and the Stonehenge part. So topography and water, absolutely critical to understanding this prehistoric landscape and the monuments within it. Views and visibility, not the only component of setting, but a major element of setting. That then extends to visual and physical and archaeological relationships between monuments, looking at the setting of individual monuments themselves. It's well established in English planning policy and decision making that where a monument or a building contributes to the OUV of a place, change to it or its setting affects the OUV of the whole. So we set out some of the key individual monuments as a starting point for further assessment. We then describe the character of the World Heritage Site, because change can affect that and therefore change people's ability to appreciate and understand the OUV of the site. We look at woodland and vegetation. You know, that they play quite a major role in the experience of both parts of the site. And then finally, we look at key detractors, those elements already in place in the landscape and the surrounding area, which are causing a degree of harm. Because it's really important in the cumulative assessment that existing harm is taken into account when thinking about further future harm. The key difference between the two parts is that for the Stonehenge part, there's an additional section on the astronomical alignments. So what I'll briefly do now is I'll just show some sample content from the SPD to sort of set out some of this descriptive material. So just move to the next slide. So here, this is from the Avebury part. On the left, some of the initial analysis around terrain, how the site sits within that quite structured landscape with the elevated land to the south and up to the downs to the east, but that more open valley landscape is heading out to the north. Looking at the character of that landscape in the figure on the right, moving on to the left. Next slide. A lot of analysis in the SPD you will see is around modelling visibility, zones of theoretical visibility based on both bare earth, i.e. no buildings and vegetation, but also taking into account buildings and vegetation. We've used this for individual monuments, but also for the World Heritage Site as a whole, as a composite, to get ideas about where in that landscape change may visually become more prominent. And from that and from field analysis and field work, a whole network of static viewpoints, but also emphasizing the importance in both parts of the landscape of dynamic viewpoints, of moving along routeways or along ridge lines, and how much those more dynamic views contribute to the appreciation of place and its setting. Next slide. And then through the document sample viewpoints. And we're really, really clear throughout the whole document that these aren't the only viewpoints. This is not every single view that exists in the World Heritage Site. One of the key steps in the assessment process will be for an applicant, for an assessor, to agree those viewpoints at the scoping stage. And they will need to sort of understanding where the development is, understanding the setting of the site and the monuments, then put forward a series of viewpoints for assessment, both static and potentially dynamic. Next, please. Stonehenge, very similar sequence of analysis, looking at its sort of more subtle, more gentle landscape setting. Once again, the topography there does really structure the experience, and particularly at Stonehenge, this more distant network of distant ridge lines, which give that layering wider landscape. Next. Then, network of static viewpoints, and also at Stonehenge, both public right-of-way viewpoints, but also sort of open. It's access by consent land. It's not public. It's not legally accessible, but consent is given to access that land. So open land for people to move around, and stressing the importance when we're looking at setting assessments of not just looking at the map on the left-hand side of the screen with its fixed points, but thinking more about movement through that landscape. Moving on, next slide. Once again, a sample of viewpoints, enabling people to understand, many parts of the Stonehenge landscape are very open, big skies, quite limited development, making sure that that really comes across in the document. Next slide, please. Then, as with Avebury, looking at these composite ZTVs, getting a sense of how visibility rolls out into that wider landscape. And on that map on the left, you can see how those ridge lines sort of structure that longer term visibility. And then importantly, on the right for Stonehenge, very much drawing on the work of Chadbourne and Ruggles, the analysis of sort of the astronomical alignments, so that when we're thinking then about potentially quite small scale development in that wider landscape that might feature in the backdrop of those or interrupt some of those important alignments. Next slide, please. So that was a whistle-top tour through the SPD. In terms of the consultation itself, if we just move on. So we're now in the consultation period until the 17th of June. Alongside that, the document has also been provided to DCMS for them to provide to UNESCO, and we're anticipating that UNESCO and its expert advisors will provide some commentary, realistically probably sometime over the summer. We will then bring their feedback through the public consultation. That will then be brought together to finalise the SPD during August and September, with the aim for the Council to adopt the document in October 2025, at which point it will come into force to inform future development. Next slide, please. The public consultation process itself, there's three kind of avenues for this. There's the online consultation, which is the easiest to manage in many respects. The link's there. I assume that most of you on the call have already found that link. There's a full PDF of the document available, but also an accessible ODT file is also available on the website. If you or anyone else requires a printed copy, on the website, there's a contact address there for someone that can request a printed copy of the document. And then finally, and really importantly, and I'll encourage anyone, please pass the information out there. There is an in-person event to discuss the SPD in more detail on the 6th of June from 11 till 4 at the History Centre in Chippenham. So, the consultation itself is structured around the number of questions. And they're really there to help. Do you feel the SPD is actually achieving what it's set out to do? Do you understand what it's trying to achieve? Is it easy to understand and use? Can it be improved? Thinking about the process I was talking about earlier, is that clear for people? Is more clarity, more information, more explanation required in that? And then in terms of the description of the SPD, is that clear? Is that easy followable? Is there any errors in it, obvious errors, anything that you would want to comment on? So it's really important. It's about helping us shape and refine this document before it's adopted. So they're common questions, they're open answer questions, and we'll be looking for a broad range of responses, people, to enable finalisation. There is also space for general comments and feedback on the document and the process. Last slide, I think. Questions for today. Just to reiterate, any questions that you have that would really help you respond to the consultation process better. Thank you very much.
Okay, Andrew, this one is for you. As a valued stakeholder in the World Heritage Site of Stonehenge, that Wiltshire Council should consult with the representatives of the Druids and/or pilgrims who attend solstice and equinox on any future planning applications in and around the environs of Stonehenge that may be detrimental to or impact on the visitors from Stonehenge. Blessings, King Arthur Pendragon. Mel, you may also want to just add into this after Andrew's done.
In terms of consultation on planning applications, I would assume that statutory basis, landowners, key statutory consultees are informed. Others, non-statutory consultees, members of the public, are open to engage with all planning applications. But Melanie, I think it'd be better if I hand over to you.
Yeah, yes, certainly, Andrew. Thank you. Yes, thank you. A good question. You're very valued in this process, and would certainly value your feedback on the setting study. Obviously, a sacred landscape in many ways, and please do send us your written feedback, King Arthur, and we'll be very pleased to take it into account.
Thanks, Mel. We also have a question. Will there be hard copies of the SPD available to view in public libraries, example Salisbury?
Yes, would you like me to answer that one as well?
Happy to, yes.
Yes, we do. We do have some hard copies of the consultation document in the libraries that are local to the World Heritage Site. For example, Marlborough Library, Amesbury and Durrington, I believe there are hard copies in those libraries, along with printed copies of the questionnaire, so that people can send written responses back by email or by post if they prefer. I believe I've mentioned all the relevant libraries. Please, somebody else do contradict me.
I'll just confirm. So it's Marlborough, Amesbury, Durrington and Salisbury libraries. And County Hall as well.
Thank you.
Perfect. Then there is another one that says there are numerous mentions, 17, of the A303 as intrusive and distracting, but only one mention of the comings and goings of the visitor shuttle buses and large numbers of visitors that are arguably far more disruptive to the experience. Paragraph 5.7. Tourist attractions around the world from Scotland to Venice are noting that it is destructive of their ambience and ultimately of their attraction to be overwhelmed by visitors. Question, why isn't there more mention of the effect of visitor numbers and arrangements for them? Clearly the SPD can include that in its assessments. Andrew, would you like to go?
Thank you very much. Yes, interesting interesting feedback, please put that in the comments, and that's one we can explore. You know, clearly, you know, large scale visitation can cause changes to ambience and setting, and the infrastructure that comes with that. So yes, please put that in the comments and feedback.
Thank you. There was a question that asked, will you be sending out a recording of the webinar? We will be putting the link, as far as I know, onto the web page for you to be able to access. The next question is, could the supplementary guidance have impacted the house building and roadway at Larkhill to the north of Stonehenge? Andrew?
The supplementary guidance will form part of evidence base for decision making. As such, if it had been in place when that development had come forward, there would have been a HIA that, you know, followed a scoping report, etc., and that would inform decision making. Whether that would have led to a different decision or a different development, really can't know.
Thank you, Andrew. Another one is, should there be defined buffer zones around Avebury and Stonehenge World Heritage Sites?
So if we go back up to UNESCO's operational guidelines, buffer zones are not required for World Heritage Sites. They're often advised. What is required is good planning and management of change in and around a World Heritage Site. So you need a system to do that. The SPD is intended to provide that system of management and support decision making. If you just draw a big buffer zone, and I've been involved in many sites over the years with big buffer zones and little buffer zones, UK and international, you tend to end up with a lot of people saying it's outside the buffer zone, therefore it's fine. So actually a more nuanced approach as put forward by this SPD might actually deliver stronger outcomes than a very blunt buffer zone. But please, once again, in terms of the comments, there's a whole section on other comments. If there's a clear question around buffer zones, please bring that forward, and it's something that Wiltshire Council, along with its partners at Historic England and ultimately DCMS, the government, can think about in terms of the two parts of the World Heritage Site.
Thank you, Andrew. There doesn't seem to be any more questions. If anybody would like to ask any more questions, please feel free to do so. We have another question. What prompted the SPD, Andrew?
Over many years now, you stretch back, Mel will probably correct me, probably a good 5, 6, 7, 8 years, that kind of time frame, maybe longer actually, thinking about it. Wiltshire Council and the government have indicated UNESCO that a setting study would be completed, an SPD. That's been done now. So essentially it's a long-term commitment to UNESCO. There's not a sort of a singular event that has sort of brought this forward. I think, you know, it's probably been accelerated a bit by the UNESCO guidance coming out in 2022 for HIA work. Similar studies, you know, you go back 2013, Bath adopted its setting SPD. I know that Durham is going through a process of a setting study. Orkney had its from like 2009. So not every site has one. And this is just a long-term commitment that's now being met.
Thank you, Andrew. We will give it a few more minutes just to ask any more further questions. Otherwise, Andrew, you can draw it to a close. We have a comment. It says, just a comment, not related to the SPD. Great to see Byway 12 at Stonehenge clear of overnighting vehicles. Andrew, will the SPD take into account the spiritual or religious visual connection of the sacred landscape with regards to cultural spiritual heritage?
Insofar as that is expressed through the attributes of outstanding universal value and dealt with in sort of local and national planning policy, yes, but they aren't necessarily strong aspects of the current attributes of OUV as expressed in the management plan, but it is part of it, yes.
Thank you, Andrew. You are more than welcome to close, as we will not be taking any more questions at this point.
thank you very much, everyone, for your time. It's most appreciated. We look forward to receiving written comments and working our way through them. Please don't leave it to the last minute, but if you have any further questions, please post comments through the website or the face-to-face event on the 6th of June. Thank you very much, everyone, and good night.